we're at time, and I'm going to turn over the admissions from the waiting room to you, Rachel, if that's okay. And I want to welcome everybody here and thank you all for coming, especially at such a busy time of term. For those of you who have been coming to the Research Friday series for some time, you'll notice we're in a more typical Zoom format rather than the webinar format. That just means that you'll have the opportunity, if you wish to take it, to turn on your camera to participate, to have a different kind of conversation. We often don't have camera availability when we're in webinar format, but you're still welcome to use the chat function or to, I guess now raise hands function if you wish to do that kind of thing today. So while people are still coming in, I want to shift over and welcome you all, introduce myself. This is Intersections of Gender's Research Friday series. My name is Nat Hurley and I'm the Associate Director for Intersections of Gender. I'm also an Associate Professor in the Department of English and Film Studies and the Director of the Media and Technology Studies Unit. So thank you for coming today for our event with Mandy Penney, who is the lead educational developer for digital pedagogies and writing across the curriculum here at the U of A's Center for Teaching and Learning. And if you entered the room a little late, you will have missed that, or more recently, you will have missed Mandy saying that she's only been with us for 2 months and is still working remotely. So this is also, I think, a nice welcome event for Mandy, and it gives you all an opportunity to meet her and put a face to the name. And if you have questions about digital pedagogy or anything related to not just what she's talking about today, but to her work with Center for Teaching and Learning, I'm sure I'm not too forward in saying, I bet she'd like to hear from you. So without further ado, and I will introduce Mandy a little more formally shortly, but first I want to recognize the conditions of possibility for our work here at the University of Alberta, which is located on Treaty 6 territory in the lands of the Métis Nation Region 4. We all work and live on the traditional lands of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many other Indigenous peoples. Like all of our institutions, the U of A continues to be shaped by the forces of colonialism to the benefit primarily of white settlers. And in this context, I consider myself to be an implicated subject, recognizing that the work of being in good relation is very much ongoing, and that we need to kind of think carefully about what it means to be in good relation to Indigenous colleagues, communities, staff members. That work is very much in process. I'd also like to say a little bit about Research Fridays. We have imagined the space this year in its inaugural year as a venue for everyone to share and promote research and thinking, or even just to host a conversation and lunch hour bite-sized pieces. And today is our last formal event for Research Fridays this year. We're hoping that we'll be able to do this again next year. So if you have something that you know you're going to be working on either over the summer, or a conference you're going to, developing a poster, a book you want to discuss, let us know. We'd really love to have you and to host you here in this space. We suggest keeping the presentations to about 20 minutes, but the most important thing is that we create space and time for discussion and engagement. So we're not really quite so concerned about, sticking people to time as we are with just creating a conversational event. So if you have, experiments in the style of presentation or the kind of Zoom format, we haven't decided yet if we'll kind of produce an in-person version of Research Fridays in the coming year. And that's because one of the great things about the Zoom series has been that we've been able to kind of draw audiences from all over Canada and sometimes over the world. So it's become a way of reaching more people, even though I understand that, there's also a desire for us to have kind of in-person encounters as well. As I said, today is our last event in Research Fridays, but I would also like to call your attention to an additional IG research event, which is scheduled for May 10th, and that's part of our Encountering Expertise in Intersectional Health series. So we'll have a session on qualitative and quantitative research design with respect to intersectionality that will feature Joya Mishra, Daniel Holman, and Tim Huitz, and that'll be on May 10th. So keep an eye out for those registration options for you to actually do that. So, and now without further ado, I want to say a little more about the fabulous Mandy Penney. Mandy, whose pronouns are she and her, is a white, cis, queer settler originally from Newfoundland, fellow Newfoundlander. She is the lead educational developer in digital pedagogies and writing across the curriculum at the Center for Teaching and Learning here at the U of A. She is passionate about digital pedagogies, writing instruction, accessibility, and communities of practice and care. She's worked in various academic roles, most recently as a writing and learning center coordinator. Mandy advocates for equitable, values-driven, and relationship-based practices in teaching and learning. She's an active member of the Canadian Writing Centers Association and the International Writing Centers Association. Ultimately, Mandy is committed to reimagining teaching and learning possibilities at this important and challenging global moment. She's going to talk to us today about RuPedagogies, building off of something that she's recently published. And I'm not going to kind of go too far into a description of her work because I don't want to preempt her. And at this moment, then I'm just going to turn it directly over to you, Mandy. Welcome and thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of you for coming.
Thank you so much. I am just going to back up here. Thank you for the introduction and for taking the time to acknowledge the land that many of you are joining us from today. I am so excited to be here. This has been a really fun experience to sort of reflect on my research and writing journey in getting this chapter ready for publication. And I wanted to talk to all of you a little bit about some of what I discovered through my work about education and teaching and learning, and about myself, and about our pandemic teaching and learning context in post-secondary institutions. Working through this chapter really has had a hand in shaping my own pedagogies and my praxis and the commitments that I want to make to myself and the communities that I'm involved in as we move forward. Writing the chapter itself was both, I would say, a joy and a challenge. So for context, this was written, initially drafted in the summer of 2020. And what I discovered very quickly was that it is difficult to write about a pandemic during a pandemic. And to write about pandemic teaching while pandemic teaching was also a challenge. I've talked a lot with colleagues and with friends and students in a variety of contexts about my commitment to slow academia as a practice and the ways that I bristle around the co-opting of some of the concepts around resilience and productivity and self-care in post-secondary institutions. And then I still found myself tackling some of these big projects in the last 2 years. And so I appreciate having the opportunity to look back at this 2-year-old chapter newly published and to see kind of what still resonates with me as I went back through it and how my thinking and approach have evolved since that time as well. I want to say too that writing the chapter was also an experiment for me in being more explicit in writing myself into my research work. The recognition, of course, that our social location and our positionality will necessarily impact the work that we're doing, how we approach it, how others view it, and so on. Before I get into that a little bit more though, I'd like to start with a brief land acknowledgement of my own out of respect for the land where I live and raise my children. So I'm joining all of you today from the city colonially known as London, Ontario, on land that is governed by the London Township Treaty of 1796. So these are the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Wauk, and the Attawandaron peoples. And I recognize that, of course, many of you are likely joining us from Treaty 6 territory or elsewhere. And I would encourage you all, if you haven't already, to visit this excellent online resource, nativeland.ca, which is an Indigenous-led resource that allows you to input your current location or the place where you were born or grew up in order to learn more about the lands and the Indigenous nations for whom that land is and remains home. When we get to the end of the more formal presentation today, I'll have an opportunity to speak briefly to the importance of indigenization and anti-colonial approaches to teaching and learning in the ongoing work of dismantling white supremacist colonial structures. So I have already had an introduction. Thank you. That was wonderful. I am from the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. I previously worked at Western University in a writing center, and I've worked both as faculty and staff through the years. In terms of my home life, I am a parent to 3 children, ages 7, 8, and 10. And my partner and I live with our children and our pets in a blended family situation. And it's possible you'll hear the dogs at some point. I've been working over the last few years to more thoughtfully and explicitly incorporate my social location into teaching and writing, because I recognize that this is one way that I can resist traditional hierarchies of power and privilege and build relationships with others through a transparent and ongoing recognition of who I am and how my own positionality affects the ways that I am able to move through the world, how I perceive the world, and how I am perceived by those around me. So at the time that I was researching and writing this chapter, we were about 5 months in to the pandemic. So these are the days of sourdough bread and empty streets and, cheesy song videos from celebrities urging us all to stick together. The photos that I've assembled in this slide are intended to provide some additional context and a glimpse into my world at the time, but photos are going to be insufficient. And they're insufficient because I was not taking photos when my children struggled with the pivot to remote learning, or when they had to experience at a very young age changes that really shook their world to their core. I have a picture in the very bottom next to my 2 dogs of my partner and children walking the trail at Cape Spear in Newfoundland, the first time I was able to journey home in the summer of 2021 for the first time since the pandemic started. What I don't have is a photo of my dismay when the government of Newfoundland rightfully limited travel to the province to slow or stem the spread of the virus. And for the first time, I realized that I could not return home, even if I wanted to. I've shared a clip on the right from President Alan Shepard at Western University's announcement that classes would be moving online in March of 2020. What I don't have is a photo of me who took the week prior to that decision off of work, knowing what was coming, sitting in the anxiety and the fear as a high-risk diabetic with 3 young children. And I choose to share at this level of detail and vulnerability because I think as faculty, staff, and students in the university community, those of us who feel that we safely can normalize some of the experiences that many of us have had to go through and take a trauma-informed approach to our moment now and to our moments moving forward, especially given that the pandemic is ongoing and that we're not likely returning to 2019. Most of the contributors to the book, and I'll just briefly show you the cover because it is fabulous. Here is the cover of the book. So it is RuPedagogies of Realness, Essays on Teaching and Learning with RuPaul's Drag Race. It's purple with kind of gold lettering, and we've got some images of drag wigs and 2 people standing with their backs with glitter falling around them, a little chalkboard here saying that was a choice. Most of the contributors to this book submitted their writing prior to the pandemic and were in the process of revising their work during it. So most of the chapters in this book do not address the pandemic. I was invited by Tommy Mayberry, who is the executive director of the Center for Teaching and Learning, to contribute in place of another scholar who was at the last minute unable to contribute to the book. I had the pleasure of meeting Tommy when I worked at the Writing and Communication Center at the University of Waterloo, where she was attending the Writing and Communication Center's dissertation boot camp as a doctoral candidate, and I was teaching a master's section of that program. Finding that we had shared interests in digital media, the scholarship of teaching and learning, and equity-based teaching and learning practices, we ended up collaborating to present at McPherson Institute's research on teaching and learning at McMaster University in 2018 on the topic of Twitter pedagogies. When they reached out to me to invite me to write for the book, their deadline with the publisher, McFarland, meant that I had 3 weeks. So not only am I visiting this chapter 2 years after its initial drafting, I also only had 3 weeks to write it. So it was 3 weeks that I spent really kind of sitting with this material and brainstorming, researching, and drafting the chapter. And then, of course, revisions followed. In practice, it meant that my chapter is one of the few that writes from the perspective of the pandemic in an explicit way. Although I understand that there are talks in progress with McFarland now to produce a second book. I was interested in thinking about how the final 2 episodes of season 12, the 2 that were filmed after the show, had to halt in-person production. So this is the reunion episode where the queens come back to talk to each other and to RuPaul about their experiences, and the finale where they crown the winner. And these 2 episodes for me were both the most engaging ones and the ones that got me thinking more broadly about how media and sports and the routines of our lives are being disrupted and amended and patched and unpatched and repatched together in those early and fraught days. Rebecca comments in the chat that it was in their living room. Yes, everyone filmed from their home. And not only did they film from their home, there were no crew with them. Crew dropped off all of the equipment that they needed, and the queens took the time to set all of that up themselves. Watching RuPaul in those early months of the pandemic became kind of a brief respite for me from crisis parenting, crisis teaching, crisis learning, and all of the general overwhelm that came with that. Every episode was my opportunity to kind of sit and immerse myself in something beyond the news that was just constantly unfurling around us. And those final 2 episodes, I also had the chance to watch while chatting with my friend Jen, who lives in Toronto. And we talked to each other over Discord. At that point, I was really easing my way into digital means of socialization, which I had been immersed in prior to the pandemic, to be clear, but now, of course, it was urgent. This was the only way I could interact with the people outside of my home. So we were looking for connection and solidarity. And so I was using Discord, I was using Twitter, and I was using Animal Crossing on the Nintendo as a way of connecting with the people beyond, you know, the 4 walls of my house. The kind of starting premise of this chapter is that the final 2 episodes of season 12 offer us a useful site of analysis on what it means to do the work of placemaking and transmediation, and how the pandemic changed the media landscape in really interesting ways. And so when we talk about transmediation, what we're really talking about here is the transfer of information or of art or of text across different media, right? So what does it mean when you know, drag queens can no longer do their live performances with in-person attendance, and so now they're doing their drag performances online, sometimes live, sometimes asynchronously. And the chapter really ended up, again, in this kind of unusual meld for me of research and autoethnography / self-reflection became about these 4 things. Firstly, my relationship with the show itself. Secondly, the show as a paratext of the classroom and the university. So what are the similarities between them and how can each inform the other? How RuPaul is a public pedagogue. How is he a public educator? And whether his attempts to enact communities of care in these final 2 episodes of the season successful? And more importantly, were they ethical? And I'll argue that is a complicated question. Finally, and woven throughout the chapter, I would say, are my questions about capitalist and colonial structures and how they prevent ethical engagement and relationships, both in the show and in our post-secondary institutions. What I wrote in the book is that it is important for us to lean on public pedagogies, right? That in popular culture texts, these moments of public pedagogy are important for us in academic institutions, who at the same time as the show was struggling to make sense of a world that had changed, while also supporting our colleagues, while supporting students. You know, the presence of the current pandemic inflected media landscape really makes clear to me that transmediation is not just about the flow of, you know, a text or information across different media. It's about the flow of media beyond and on the other side of everything we thought we knew, right? None of us knew in March of 2020 what we were looking at 2 years down the road and where we would be, right? And so, you know, I'm just in this sort of constant state of questioning. What is the role of technology? How do we use it to create human connection in the classroom and beyond, alongside meaningful opportunities for engaged and accessible education? For those of you who have access to the chat right now, very quickly, have you watched RuPaul's Drag Race before? Just a quick Y or N, just so I can get a quick kind of sense. Seeing mostly yeses, some all of thems, a handful of no's, a religiously. Interestingly, there is some really good scholarship out there on RuPaul as Preacher that is fascinating. And Luke points out, yes, of course, the finale for the current season is tonight, which is a super fun time to be talking to you all about this. So I came to RuPaul's Drag Race after 8 seasons had already aired. I was not there in its inception. And for any of you who have seen season 1, it wasn't available at the time that I came to it in season 8. It was very hard to come by, and it was interesting to go back and watch how the production values shift over time. But I came out as queer in 2016 when I started dating my current partner. And so that first year, 2016 to 2017, was really a time when I was just devouring and absorbing everything that I could on queer communities, queer history, queer culture, queer novels, anything. And it's not that I hadn't engaged with them before, it was that I hadn't engaged with them as an out queer person. So I often tell people that that was my year of Blue is the Warmest Color. That was my year of The Price is Salt. That was my year of Bebo Brinker and Pride, and a revisit of the excellent HBO kind of docu-film And the Band Played On. It was the year of Stone Butch Blues. It was the year of the Indigo Girls. In the summer of 2017, I traveled with my family, and in Montreal, I watched the first few episodes of season 8 on Netflix. And the performer Kim Chi, who you see at the top of this slide, really just kind of was one of my favorites of the season. And in the finale, she performed a song called Fat, Femme, and Asian. And so here I am, a fat woman, an out lesbian who veers closer to the femme side of things, if we're going to sort of break it down that way. And I'm watching all of this, and it is just a revelation for me, right? I loved the pageantry and the spectacle and the artistry and the technique and the moments of learning that I was taking in. And so again, coming to it in season 12 was coming back to something not just comfortable, but almost joyful for me. And that was the lens through which I was watching it, even while I recognized, even early in my viewing of this show, that there were also very valid critiques of RuPaul, of the show, of the ways that it privileges whiteness, of the way that it is implicated in, you know, a capitalist structure as a money-making venture. It brought me joy. So because of my ongoing interest in my own work in public scholarship and multimodal writing for broad audiences, I typically argue that we both can and should engage with pop culture moments of public pedagogy in practice. So observing and reflecting on the content, so the what is said, and the strategies they use in delivering that education. I think that's especially important given our responsibility for engaging and accessible teaching and learning spaces, including classrooms, writing centers, and of course, teaching and learning centers. RuPaul's Drag Race itself, as fans of you will know, has paratexts that diverge from and inform the flagship show itself. So any number of spin-offs, essentially. So global spin-offs in a variety of countries, including Canada, including the UK, any number of countries have their own versions of Drag Race. There are series that World of Wonder, the production company, shares on YouTube, including Fashion Photo Review, where queens from previous seasons will come to review the looks, the runway looks of seasons that are current, and then Untucked. And for anyone who watches Untucked, this is the behind the scenes conversations between the queens when they are together at the back of the runway, typically waiting for results. And so Untucked is almost presented in, you think back to those, the talk shows of the 90s and you needed the security there, and it was where the arguments were happening. And yeah, as Rebecca pointed out, you're only getting half the story watching this show. This shows a lot more of the interactions that are unfolding, sometimes in less scripted ways than what you're seeing on the primary show itself. RuPaul also has a podcast, What's the Tea with Michelle Visage. So in an earlier chapter of the book, one of the authors, Florian Zitzelberger, says that digital engagement with drag offers us kind of what he calls an affective, emotional alignment with these characters, with these queens, as performers, as influencers, and as educators. And drag has always leaned heavily into the live performance aspect of the work. But of course, in 2020, drag is shifting online, although now we're starting to revert back to more and more kind of in-person options. And the show itself relies heavily on these kind of moments of teaching and learning, where they have learning objectives and themes that they want the audience to take away. And where and when these happen have been fairly consistent, right? So there are these interactions, conversations between the contestants while they're getting ready for the runway. So while they're in the workroom, putting on their makeup and getting into drag, someone will ask a question, and that question is always meant to provoke a conversation or a sharing of some kind from another contestant about something they have gone through. So in these conversations, they're tackling things like homophobic violence, conversion therapy, HIV/AIDS, racism, and mental health. And then you also have the contestants who are talking to the producers in these sort of confessional style out of the workroom conversations. And so they're often asked to elaborate on some of the experiences that they're alluding to in the workroom. The other thing that RuPaul does is he offers us history lessons. So when he is setting up a challenge, for example, he'll offer some background into LGBTQIA 2S+ history as a way of leading into what's called the maxi challenge, or the major challenge of that episode. And the moments of education are made intimate, right? They're meant to be a glimpse into the individual person's experience. And by design, I think, in a lot of ways, they remain individual. It is about learning about that person's history and journey and where they are now, with little to no conversation about the systemic factors, including, of course, racism, white supremacy, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, that inform the experiences that these queens are having. So I'm looking at these final two episodes and I'm saying, okay, what is the practice of community and care that is happening here? Quick yes in the chat if you watched these two episodes, the reunion and the finale. Seeing mostly yeses and a handful of no's. Okay. So again, we're not, this is not the big glitzy spectacle it is in pre-pandemic seasons where they book out a theater and thousands of people come. There are 2 or 3 theaters in LA that they typically use for this. Instead, crew drop cameras off to the drag queens. They set it all up themselves and they perform and join in the reunion content from their homes without any of the other queens or RuPaul around them. And the reunion episode, as you can see on the bottom screen here, is very much set up to emulate what we were all going through at the time. It's the Zoom screen. It is also, as this little screen capture shows, hearkening back to the Brady Bunch, right? So the television show where that blended family had all those boxes. So this isn't even an unrecognizable format for us pre-pandemic. And RuPaul at the beginning of this reunion episode checks in with all of the queens. And he says, I want to applaud all the queens like never before, who worked like never before to ensure that this show must go on. He also thanks the crew and he says, out of caution for everyone's safety, we are all working from home tonight, right? And virtually most people at this point, virtually everyone is work from home. And it mirrors that kind of common experience of our primarily or fully closed physical campuses, and with a similar kind of messaging around health and safety, right? He says, for the first time in the history of this show, safe is a good word. And pre-pandemic, safe meant you weren't up for elimination that night. And it meant only that you were mediocre, you were not the worst. And so he would always say, safe isn't good. But here, now, finally, safe is good. And the show really pulls on a lot of our common experiences at the time. We've got RuPaul's cheesy 80s geometric background, right? We were all doing those images, cartoons, memes behind us. One of the primary judges, Carson Kressley, had a moment where they mimicked his screen freezing and glitching. And so they were freeze frame shots of him making just these really awkward and hilarious faces. One of the contestants, Heidi and Closet, at one point they went back to the camera into her home. The chair was empty. And so RuPaul was like, Heidi, Heidi, and you hear the toilet flushing off camera. And so there's a nod to the kind of ridiculous but shared moments in our current reliance on technology, right? So, and there are things that we still do now at the end of the call. What do? We all wave, right? We want to show you in a bodily kind of way, we're here and I see you. But in asking each queen, as he does one by one, how are you and where are you? There's only time for really brief answers, right? Yes, I'm fine. I'm joining you from my parents' basement in New Jersey, right? And when we look at the research on teaching and pedagogy and building out strong communities, there's some pretty clear trends in terms of how we do this. And a lot of it comes down to making space for the conversations, right? And doing the active listening work and the collaboration. So in sort of setting it up so that they can only answer briefly, these are rote questions that RuPaul's ultimately asking of them, right? So Jessie Stommel argues in this really good article called Designing for Care, Inclusive Pedagogies for Online Learning, that we need to set up online and teaching spaces, not just for business as usual and for, as we hear increasingly, limiting learning loss, but for the explicit nurturing of care and community. So if educators are going to ask questions, they have to be genuine, they have to be open-ended, and we have to wait for the answers. Here, RuPaul does none of those things, right? And his inability or unwillingness to engage in some of those deeper ways and to really listen to the answers that he's being given is not just a season 12 phenomenon. So now I'm thinking back pre-pandemic to my experiences watching Drag Race to think about how, as a successful Black drag queen, he has a history of being dismissive of queens who challenge him. Quick yes in the comments if you've watched the show and have seen this happen. Even when what they are sharing are their own experiences of racism and other kinds of trauma. And I expect for fans of the show that this will be very familiar. Does anyone know whose story I'm about to tell to you? The Vixen, one of my favorite drag queens, and undeniably given what we call the villain edit in their season, which is season 10 of Drag Race. The Vixen's entrance catchphrase was, "I'm just here to fight." And the Vixen's exit sentence was, "Evil triumphs when good queens do nothing." The Vixen is a Black activist queen. She's deeply embedded in activist and advocacy movements in her drag and beyond. And the conflicts that she experiences with white queens on her season, most notably Eureka O'Hara and Aquaria, magnify the ways that in the show, and I would say in the university writ large, that anti-Black racism has yet to be addressed in a meaningful way. So the Vixen has these verbal sparring matches with these two white queens. Only the Vixen is ever critiqued for the argument having happened. Only the Vixen is asked whether she could have done anything differently or modulated her tone differently. Eureka and Aquaria are never held to account for their roles in these conflicts. And Aquaria at one point starts crying when the Vixen is talking to her and calls her negative, right? So she really leans into the angry Black woman narrative. And during the televised portions of her arguments with Aquaria and Eureka, the Vixen calls attention to the way that the camera really mediates our experiences and affirms racist stereotypes. In the reunion episode, which is what you're seeing in the bottom screen, is her look for the reunion episode. The Vixen and fellow Black queen Asia O'Hara, top left on your screen, are made to push back against their teacher and mother when the Vixen is called out for these arguments while the white women are not. RuPaul says that she stirs the pot, and the Vixen says, everybody's telling me how I should react, but nobody's telling her, meaning Eureka, how to act. Asia O'Hara, another Black queen, is upset with the way that the Vixen is treated. By this point, the Vixen has left the stage. She's no longer participating in this reunion. And she says that they should not have let their sister walk away during Pride, and that she understands that the ongoing racism and violence that the Vixen has endured throughout her life speaks to the challenges that she's having this season. RuPaul has an opportunity here as an educator, right, to push back on racist depictions of Black queens as combative. He's a public voice. He can educate the audience on drag and queerness and offer a platform for advocacy and a demonstration of what anti-racist care could look like. Here's what he says to Asia instead, and really yells at Asia. I come from the same goddamn place she comes from. And here I am, and you see me walking out. I've been discriminated against by white people for being Black, by Black people for being gay, by gay people for being too femme. Did I let that stop me from getting to this chair? What he's doing here is not only avoiding this kind of nuanced discussion of complex systemic violence and marginalization, but he's also focusing in on individual reactions and individual trauma with little to no reference to the systemic ways that violence is exerted on Black bodies every day. And the Vixen, in an interview with Patrick Lenton in 2020, says it happens every season. It takes a long time for the Black queens to get equal recognition, if they ever do, right? It is more commonly, the night of 1,000 Madonnas, not the night of 1,000 Toni Braxtons. And then once you're into the season, every altercation, every lip sync battle, everything you get, you see the bias, you see the people distrust the queens of color. You see them make a million excuses for a white queen's misbehavior. So our host here really, and this is where in the chapter I talk a little bit more about the corporate culture and the for-profit structure of the show. And so what's happening here is that RuPaul is setting himself up as the example of the good life, right? The paradigmatic sphere for defining individual success and fulfillment. And we know this about RuPaul, right? What he talks about when he talks about queen success is their individual charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent. And Vixen says later in the interview, I thought I was going to have to set my activism aside when I started drag. I was very active in my community in college, and I ran a youth pride center, but bars say you're here to entertain, right? Which is ultimately what RuPaul's looking for. You don't want to bring down the mood. So I put it away for a while, and then after seeing a lot of casual racism in the club scene, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I just had to be myself and speak my voice. And one of the things that I'm seeing emerging in scholarship on teaching and learning, especially in what we call sort of para classroom spaces, learning centers, CTLs and the like, is a conversation about how activism and advocacy work outside the institution can really usefully inform our own pedagogies. And I know that many scholars are often doing that work or trying to enact that work themselves. Similar kinds of controversies when we think about trans folks and trans drag queens. RuPaul famously asserted at one point in 2017, 2018, that he would not permit a drag queen who had undergone surgery to perform on the show, and of course, a ton of pushback. At the time that I published the chapter, there had not been yet someone who walked into the workroom in the first instance as an out trans drag queen. There has, of course, been since then, including Gia Gunn, whose tweet criticizing RuPaul for their comments you see here on the screen. Others came out during the process of the show or after the show. So contestants like Carmen Carrera, a vocal critic of RuPaul, bottom right of your screen there. I also think about Peppermint and Monica Beverly Hills. And I just want to remind you all that as I'm thinking about these sort of really overarching issues within the franchise, I'm writing it at the time that we're still learning about COVID. And we were starting to gather data, and it's no surprise, I'm sure, to most of us that there are inequalities in how the pandemic has affected people, both in terms of who gets COVID and who experiences the financial ramifications and who lockdowns hit the hardest, and so on and so on. And so what I have on the right-hand side of the screen here, again, just for that kind of context setting, is a screenshot from the City of Toronto's website from some work that they were doing in 2020, looking at the relationship between income group and case rate of COVID per 100,000. And so you can see that by a very large measure, the lowest income folks who had spoken to public health and disclosed their income status were experiencing COVID cases at the rate of 504 people per 100,000, whereas the highest income folks were experiencing COVID at the rates of 162 people per 100,000, which is a pretty marked disparity, right? And similar research has happened along racial lines as well, lines of work, and so on. And so all of these intersectional issues are really coming to play here. And that really got me thinking about what Henry Giroux said about pedagogies of resistance a while back in 2002. He said that issues regarding schooling and social justice, persistent poverty, inadequate healthcare, and the growing inequalities between the rich and the poor have been either removed from the inventory of public discourse and public policy, or, here I emphasize, factored into talk show spectacles that highlight private woes, individual problems, with little relationship either to public life or to potential remedies that demand collective action. And it's that collective action that we don't see being advocated for in any meaningful way, right? And on the bottom left of the screen here, does anyone know who that is in the cute little pink Animal Crossing shirt with Judy the bear on it? Just curious to see if he's familiar to anyone. He was a contestant in an earlier season, no longer does drag, and a large part of the reason was because he was given the villain edit, and he speaks out quite frequently about the conditions on set, the low pay, the poor food, the poor working conditions, the treatment of contestants by RuPaul. And so he's since left drag altogether. That is, yep. And so they no longer go by their drag name at all. They prefer just to be called Jeremy. So their name is Jeremy Carey. And he is someone else who has spoken out a lot about kind of the conditions on set and spoke up in defense of the Vixen when everything happened during her season. And now maybe briefly, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the episode that in many ways for me was the hardest to watch. Does anyone recognize this episode or know the name of the challenge that the performers in the bottom left-hand corner were doing? Okay. So this is the Best Judy challenge. Yeah. So they were making over their best friends. And the issue here is that RuPaul, exactly, drawing on that queer notion of friends of Dorothy, right? Which is Judy Garland was an icon in the queer community. And so the issue here is not that it was the challenge itself was premised around Judy Garland, but rather that RuPaul credits Judy Garland with what happened at Stonewall. He says Judy Garland was directly responsible for queer people standing up and saying, I'm going to take no more. And then they carry on. And who they don't mention, and who you see on the right hand of your screen here, are Marsha Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, the trans folks and drag queens who actually were responsible for Stonewall. And what RuPaul did here is he conflated Sylvia Rivera saying in an interview, of course, Judy Garland had died just a day or so prior, and her saying like, this has impacted me. And he took that and ran with it and said that Judy Garland, this white actress, is responsible for the entire queer movement from Stonewall on. No mention whatsoever. I know we're running a little short on time, so what I'm going to briefly say here is that I learned more about drag and LGBTQIA2S+ history and culture from the contestants themselves, who've done amazing work in the show and beyond, which gets me to thinking about how our students themselves and partnering with them in our work is something we should all be thinking about as well. Going forward, where I sort of end up is sort of this critical reflection on my own social location, my positionality, my values, relationships, and really thinking, going back to that idea of a values-based pedagogy, which is rooted primarily, but not exclusively, in Indigenous approaches to teaching, learning, and research that will allow us to kind of challenge capitalist, racist, and colonial structures in favor of, and these are the things I'm really trying to develop out in my role at UAlberta, sorry, are communities of practice and care, inclusive pedagogies, trauma-informed teaching and learning, and a focus on accessibility. So just very briefly, this is me trying to sketch out the parts of my role and some of the things that I hope to talk about. But I would love to take some time to chat with folks and to ask, how the pandemic has affected what you value most in education. What do you want to take with you on the other side? And what do we want to leave behind? I'm going to pause there and open it up for conversations, questions.
Thank you so much, Mandy. Do you want to keep the screen share on? Do you want to be in a different view? What's your preference here?
I think
okay.
I'm going to shut it down just so if folks do have their camera off that I can see them.
Okay, great. So we do have a few minutes now for questions. We have about 15 minutes. If anybody wants to weigh in response to Mandy's questions that she's already posed to the group, or if people have questions of their own that they would like to open up to her, this would be a good time to start thinking about that. Somebody just entered the waiting room. Yeah, but here we are. Well, maybe while people get themselves gathered and thinking, oh wait, no, we have a question here. Please take it away.
Hi, this is Jean, and I'm in the drama department, but crossover with gender and beyond. And I'm just talking because I actually teach a drag course that's been and it happened in the pandemic. So there's so much there. But it's looking at it looking through critical race, gender, sexuality, and disability and indigeneity, ways of seeing how we are around our gender and our desires around sex and sexuality and beyond. And it was very powerful because we were in our different spaces, right, and different countries. This is a graduate course and allowed 4th and 5th year students to be in it. And how much the space in a university actually creates a safer space, right? So we had very religious parents, and they can't have them hearing that the fact that they are non-binary, things like that, or they're in a country where it's just not even okay to be queer in any way, and then have to create a piece, right? Like and it didn't have to be drag, it could be drag kings and queens, but it also was just about desire and so forth. And what that process, and as me as a professor, as a dyke, okay, how is this safe for me when your parent is listening to this and so forth? So it was really powerful, and it made me also, again, have to use a lot of podcasts and all these other ways of coming into it rather than in the classroom and fully embodied. And I want to bring out Compton because it was a great film to start with, the Screaming Queens, which is before, the other big moment. I just forgot. But yeah. So I just think it's really great what you're doing and what you're talking about. And it'd be nice to work together about how to bring your, what you wrote and all that connected to RuPaul, because we had those conversations that were really complicated because there's this big love and there's this big concern, and even not wanting to participate with him. So yeah, and I was surprised the first season I was in Toronto doing my PhD, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this is even happening. So it was quite radical at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
And then it slowly starts to change. But it was nice to use that first episode because it was these women or females who were fighters, and then their drag queens had to make them like super high femme and like them. And I think that was really powerful about the performance of gender, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, really thanks for your work, and I'm just excited that we're talking about it and making it something, because we have this low art and high art kind of way of looking at theater and beyond. And so I think that's exciting. So thanks for your work.
Oh, thank you. And it's so nice to meet you. The high art, low art thing is another, it's a hard topic to move through. And when I did my master's thesis, it was on comic books. And so I experienced a lot of that in the mid 2000s when it wasn't a common thing to even look at. But yes, absolutely. I would love to talk more. I've often thought about those issues around security and privacy around, in the world that I was working in as kind of academic staff. My conversations were about privacy related to, the background. What were folks going to see? What did it mean to insist that students had to open up their home life to us with all that could entail, and their reasons why they maybe didn't want to. So yeah, I hadn't even thought about it from the perspective of, if you are somewhere where it's not safe to do that and to have the conversations, how do you leverage other spaces to make that room?
I'd like to join in on this conversation a little bit. And I think what I want to ask about is how we think about that word safety, or what we think about as the safe space of a classroom. Because I think that one of the things that is very challenging to manage is that for many people, ideas are unsettling and create feelings of unsafety, and that in some ways is tied very much to teaching, especially with respect to gender and sexuality, colonialism, violent history, as you talked, Mandy, at the beginning about trauma-informed pedagogies. And one of the things we know is that you can't predict in advance what a triggering thing is. And we often assume, often wrongly, that the content that reproduces a traumatic event is a trigger for trauma itself. Whereas for some person, it might just be hearing a car on the street or the rustling of a doorknob. That seems somehow like a mundane thing. And that pedagogically, can we actually correct for the feeling of unsafety rather than think about what it means to cultivate moments of unsafety, or to kind of think about what that means in an educational context. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how it is that we can work with feelings of unsafety rather than strive to create safety at every turn, because we bring differential histories into the classroom and we can't always manage for our students. Sometimes pedagogy in the service of safety can be the whitest thing going, or the safest thing go, you know what I mean? Absolutely. And to kind of think about how we engage the scene of unsafety seems like really at the heart of pedagogical practice. And I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I agree. The question I always ask when folks talk about wanting to develop the safe space is, safe in what way and for whom? Right? Because, it's too easy to leverage the language of safety to avoid challenge, right? And we know who typically does the challenging around some of these hard topics, right? And so it often acts in service of privilege and power. And so one of the ways that I've been sort of shifting my thinking on that, and I never did use the language of trigger for that reason, right? That you can't account for triggers. It's not a one-to-one linear relationship, right? And so I typically in the past have used the language of content note. Just gonna let you know, we're gonna be talking about these heavy topics so that folks have the the advanced knowledge of it. But rather than safe space, there's a really great Medium article on the concept of the accountable space, right? About moving away from systems that and setups and frameworks that privilege power and that privilege whiteness into accountability. And there's a whole framework for what that can look like, but it starts with building out your class from the outset in such a way that those conversations are made explicit. As a class, what do we value? As a class, how are we responsible to each other? As a class, how do we want to tackle these heavy topics? And at least in my experience, when I've had those conversations with students or have supported faculty in having those conversations with students, students will rise to the occasion on that. And when you co-develop the guidelines for interaction and care and responsibility and what accountability will look like in these spaces if someone is doing harm, that is more tangible and something that they will take with them beyond the classroom, right? And so it becomes a conversation and also about relationship building, right? About taking time to get to know each other and to get students thinking about their social location, their positionality, what that means for their learning, who are they in the classroom, what voices are dominating, and bring them in explicitly to those conversations and those pedagogical decisions as partners who also want to be a part of that learning environment. Rebecca, I see your hand. Did you want to contribute?
Yeah, I think it's also, as I was part of the like GSA in high school, they had very welcoming, like on the first week of school, they would say, hey, why don't we have our name down in our pronouns, and whatever pronoun you wrote down, that's how the teacher would reference you. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a really good idea, because other people might use different pronouns. And so just getting it out of the way is so important.
It is, yeah. And I mean, we've seen language around pronouns shift a lot too. And this is something that my executive director, Tommy, has done some really great talks on, is on pronoun use in education. You know, we used to say preferred pronouns, and now more commonly we say pronouns. What are your pronouns? And now there's this really interesting emerging conversation about making sure that we're not forcing people to divulge their pronouns, right? Not everyone is out, or folks may be out in some spaces and not in others. So rather than saying, you know, can everyone give me your pronouns, please? Now I share mine and open up that space of possibility for sharing theirs. They can share theirs, right? And so that is another way to approach it. But I think you're right. It's about finding ways to be inclusive from the outset and build it in, as you said, from the start of the year or from the start of the term, and set it as an expectation and a norm for moving forward.
Well, the question of pronouns is an interesting one, not only because it is about shifting context, but that it also becomes one way of again fixing gender, right? That we want to stabilize something and therefore establish the normative use in it. And I've heard emerging strategies that, in fact, the one thing that seems to work very well for some teachers is to ask people to really learn each other's names, not just to learn their pronouns, so that you can actually reference people as Mandy just said, as opposed to as she just said, or they just said. And that this also kind of becomes a way of creating more kind of social bonds in the classroom, rather than kind of gestures where the pronoun can somehow mean a lot of different things and you kind of absolve yourself of the responsibility. And I think there is something, and this is why it's interesting that these issues come up around a talk about drag and pedagogy, that, you know, there's something that there's a kind of wish subtending a lot of our conversations about gender, to stabilize it, to somehow make it a knowable thing rather than an ambiguous thing or a non-normative thing, or that desire might interrupt the wish for normativity or easy normativities. And I don't dismiss people's wish for normativity, honestly. I think that, you know, sometimes you can't just kind of take aim at normativity as if it's the only technology of violence, although it can be. But I think that there's something to be respected about the wish for normativity, but also that's something that reproduces a structure of kind of eliminating the discomforts that I think drag and gender play and transness sometimes allow us to unsettle and kind of put into movement and to challenge the way we see the world through those things too.
Yeah, and making space for that slippage, right? And that unknowability. And when Penney talks about pronouns and the pronouns that she uses, I know that, you know, the language he uses is, you know, you can use he, she, they with respect, and any of the above in any context, you can slip back and forth between them. But I also really like the idea of getting to know each other's names, because there's this other issue that we're all too familiar with in academia around names that folks will find challenging to pronounce, right? And the lack of desire to learn how to pronounce. And so I think, you know, by setting that expectation that we're going to get to know each other's names, you're also wading into those kind of intersectional waters, right? Around our assumptions around names that we know impact, especially, but not exclusively, international students who come into our communities, and that we know are going to affect them, not just in the classroom, but once they start, you know, job hunting and move out into the world. And we already see students assuming westernized white names in order to try and mitigate some of those issues. I like that.
Well, I mean, I think at the heart of pronouns is I think, or in their best version, is how do you like to be called? And often we like to be called by a name and not just a pronoun, right? I mean, and that is an act of responsiveness that seems to kind of get us somewhere different, not better or worse than pronouns, but somewhere different too. I noticed that the thanks are starting to pour in, which is usually a sign that we're at time. But if there's any last question or comment that anybody would like to make or offer to the conversation, a lot of people have not had a chance to weigh in. And if you would like to, now would be the moment. I see no burning hands or comments in the chat. So allow me to thank you, Mandy, and to thank you all for joining at this very busy time of term. It's so great that people come out to this conversation. I'm so thankful to you all for having joined Research Fridays throughout the year. And the recording of this event will also be available, so you can return to Mandy's beautiful insights and share you know, the news about the work that she's doing at CTL, as well as the possibility that you can follow up with your friends. So if we want to have a look at the video once it's posted, keep an eye on the IG page. Rachel will send out information. And I wish we could have a thunderous applause that is so well deserved after an event like this. So we can do the kind of signing applause, and I'm very grateful again that you all could come, and I hope you're all keeping as well as possible at this really stressful time of term. And thank you, Mandy, again for your work today. We're very grateful. Have a great rest of your days, everybody, and a nice weekend.
Take care, everyone.